going to turn it over to Essie. You're already sharing your screen. So today we are talking about a project that Branching Minds has been planning for a bit that we're really excited about. And it's all about how Branching Minds and the SRSS IE behavior screener can help you with proactive strategies for supporting behavior needs. I'm Emily Roseberry. I am a VP of Product here at Branching Minds, and I'm joined by my brilliant colleague, Dr. Essie Sutton. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Essie, and I'm the Director of Learning Science at Branching Minds. I'm also an applied developmental psychologist, and my research background focuses on students' social emotional learning and behaviors in schools and classrooms.
So in other words, the absolute perfect person to be helping us kick off this discussion. So I think we just covered the welcomes and introductions part of this. But what we're going to do is we're going to kind of split this session in half. It's half practice, half product. So we have both representatives of that here. Essie is going to start with just an overview of what behavioral screening is, some specifics on the SRSS IE instrument. So if you are joining this session and you're someone who has never used that instrument, never heard of that instrument, don't worry, we're going to kind of go through the basics. If you are someone who is already using it, you're also going to get a lot out of this though, because we're going to talk about how that instrument, the results of that instrument can and should be used for intervention and support planning. One of the big takeaways that I've been getting from the sessions on SEL and wellness that I've attended so far during this summit have really emphasized for me that notion of if we're going to assess, we have to be ready to provide the follow-up. And that's certainly something that we agree with and that we want to talk through in the session today. And then I will be going over kind of introducing the partnership that we have with CI3T, which is the organization that published the SRSSIE instrument. I'm going to do a product demo for you. We're doing some excited development around behavioral screening right now, and I want to make sure, actually, you'll be the first people to see it. So message your friends if they're in another session and make sure they come here, because you're going to be the first people to see this development. And then we'll kind of talk about, if you're thinking, this is something I should be doing in my district, we should have systemic behavior screening, we can give you some tips. So we're really excited, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Essie.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily Rose. So I'm going to start off by giving a bit of an overview of behavioral screening more broadly before jumping into some of the specifics around the SRSS-IE. So first off, what is behavior screening? So similar to using data from academic screening tools, data from universal behavioral screening tools can also be used within a tiered system of support. So specifically, we would use this type of behavioral data to help us, first of all, identify and detect students for whom Tier 1 efforts may be insufficient. It also allows us to inform teacher-delivered low-intensity support, so things that teachers can be implementing in the classroom context to help address some of these behavioral needs. And then also connect students with evidence-based Tier 2 for some and Tier 3 for a few strategies, practices, and programs. So again, very similar to how we might use an academic screening tool, behavioral screening tools that are implemented universally, meaning we are administering them across all students, can really help inform kind of these different components of an MTSS or multi-tiered framework. However, it's important to kind of point out some of the similarities, but also differences between behavioral screening and what we know as SEL or social emotional skill assessments or screeners. So social emotional competency screeners are assessments that are typically used to identify students' social emotional strengths and challenges. So really probing into some of those social emotional skills that we want to be promoting through SEL. They also assess the frequency and the strength of these social emotional skills. And they're used to help educators guide the implementation of SEL programs and teaching practices. So again, these are all important things. However, they can be very different or look different from something like a behavioral or traditional behavioral screener, which is essentially used to assess major behavioral challenges of childhood and adolescence. They're also used to provide integrated tier 2 and tier 3 supports. So not just siloing academic behavior and social emotional well-being, but really providing more integrated support plans for students. They can be used to help assess the frequency and strength of observable, externalizing, and internalizing behaviors. And they can also be used to guide the implementation of targeted behavioral health interventions and classroom management strategies. So the difference between these two types of screeners or assessments will become more apparent as we dive into the SRSS IE, but it's much more focused on observable behaviors linked to things like externalizing and internalizing problems.
Essie,
All right.
Question from
Yes.
the Q&A. Is it possible or advisable to administer both an SEL screener and a behavior screener to all students?
Yes. So both an SEL or social emotional competency screener or assessment can be used alongside a behavioral screener. They ultimately are assessing and measuring different underlying constructs. And if we look, there has been some research kind of comparing SEL screeners with behavioral screeners, and we do see that there is some overlap. So there are some students who have needs in both areas, but there also are students that have very specific needs. Some students might have more behavioral needs. Some students might have more social emotional skill needs. So using both instruments helps us really understand more of the nuances around the type of support we should be providing for students. So because they are measuring different constructs, they can, both tools can be used together or at the same time. All right, so the SRSS IE, which stands for the Student Risk Screening Scale, I think. I think that's what it is, so many letters. So it is a free universal screener. It consists of 12 items that are used to detect students who are at increased likelihood for antisocial or internalizing behavioral concerns across grades K through 12. The way it works is that teachers complete the screener for each student in their classroom. So it's a teacher-facing assessment. The teachers are responding to the frequency of students displaying specific behaviors. And these are behaviors like aggressive behaviors, lying, cheating, stealing, extreme shyness, anxiety. So these are the types of behaviors that teachers are kind of going through the list of students and identifying the frequency at which they are observing them amongst each student in their classroom. Just like any other universal screener, it's recommended that it's used 3 times across the school year. So the first implementation would be in the fall after students have been in their classroom for at least 4 weeks. The second administration would be in the winter, just 2 weeks before the holiday break in December. And then the last administration would be approximately 6 to 8 weeks before the end of the school year. So there's enough time left in the school year after the assessment is administrated to review those results and kind of make plans for the following school year. So all of the items, all of those behaviors that teachers are rating on the SRSS IE are divided into 2 subscales. So the first subscale is the externalizing subscale, and this refers to all behavioral difficulties that are directed outwardly by the child toward the external social environment. And externalizing behavior usually involves behavior excess, so too much of a behavior, and it's considered behavior that's inappropriate by teachers. So not what you would expect for kind of typical behavior based on the child's development, but some type of behavior that is inappropriate and in excess and essentially disruptive to the classroom environment. Whereas internalizing refers to behaviors that are directed inwardly, so away from the external environment. And that represents problems within the child, and internalizing behavior frequently involves behavioral deficits and patterns of social avoidance and withdrawal. And something that I just want to point out about both of these subscales, as well as the SRSS-IE as a whole, is that it's not a clinical diagnostic tool. So by having teachers complete this screener, which you'll see is quite brief, we're not asking teachers to diagnose students, and the results should not be used as any kind of indicator of a mental health diagnosis. It's really just an indicator that a student might need some kind of additional support. So in order to get an actual diagnosis, that would need to be completed by a trained clinician. It's a much more intensive administration. This is really just a screening tool, which means it's a first pass at identifying some students who likely need some kind of additional support.
Essie, I want to highlight a question that's coming through the chat, which is, are there any suggestions on how you would select which teacher would administer at the middle school or high school level?
Yeah, so ideally you want to have a teacher that is spending the most amount of time with the student. So in some cases in middle schools, we have a teacher that might teach a homeroom, meaning they're with the students for an extra period of time, or they're kind of the core teacher, or perhaps there's some teachers that work with students during an advisory period. So if there is a teacher or a group of teachers that are more close or know or spend more time with a group of students, we would recommend that it would be that teacher. You know, in the realities of schools today, that's not always the case, or it's not always feasible. So that doesn't always happen. I think that the important part is really providing educators with the training and kind of the groundwork for completing this type of assessment beforehand. So they are kind of aware of the fact that they're going to have to report on these behaviors in their students. Yeah. You know, they're not just given the assessment the day before and like, you know, go at it. But they're aware of the fact that they're going to be completing this assessment. And this makes them more aware of some of these behaviors. And as you'll see with the assessment, the behaviors are, you know, they're pretty extreme behaviors. And for the most part, like most students maybe don't display these behaviors, but they're pretty obvious. And I think, you know, the assessment has been tested and validated and developed with middle and high school teachers. So it is possible that they have the information or have the ability to accurately complete these assessments, or this assessment for students.
I know another thing that I learned as I was reviewing all of CI3T's kind of helpful training and documentation resources is that it's probably less important who you select. I definitely saw homeroom teachers or advisory period teachers as being like a consistent group to select. The most important thing, though, is to really make sure it's a systemic decision, that it's planned in advance, and that the folks who are going to be assigned to complete the assessment, they know. Not only do they know, but you bring up some great points. They are trained properly on exactly what to look for so that they can do a great job when it's time. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. And maybe you'll get into this later in the presentation, but there is a lot of kind of pre-work that needs to be done at schools before this type of screening tool can be effectively implemented. And that's why we're talking about it now, trying to get ahead of even the next school year, because this work takes time and there needs to be certain kinds of foundations in place in order for it to be successful.
Yes, we definitely have some tips on that at the end of the presentation.
Great. All right, so when it comes to scoring the SRSS-IE, it's pretty straightforward. Essentially, again, students are kind of rated based on the frequency of each behavior, and those items, the rating scale, which I believe is from 0 to 3 or 0 to 4, perhaps, that you're just adding up the scores for each of the items.
0 to 3, sorry. Confirm.
0 to 3.
Right the first
Thanks. So you're just, it's adding up those scores, and then you're using this kind of a table to know kind of whether the student, based on their score for the items that correspond with each subscale, if they are in that low risk range, the moderate risk range, or the high risk range. And you can see here that it's a little bit different for the middle and high school level because the items are slightly different, but it's a pretty straightforward process around identifying those students as low risk, moderate risk, or high risk based on how the teachers are kind of rating the frequency of each of the behaviors. So some of the kind of benefits of using a tool like the SRSS IE is that it's really about identifying and providing support proactively. So we're using this kind of universal screening approach to, address some of these behavioral concerns before they become really kind of too big or too large for, the school itself to address it. And one thing that's kind of frequently brought up is some of the increases in behavioral concerns that have happened as a result of COVID and, students not being in school for an extended period of time, as well as kind of all the stresses and the additional things that went on in our world during COVID, and how now there's this, increased behavioral difficulties or behavioral challenges that teachers are observing in their classrooms. So having a tool like this really helps us kind of address some of these needs and understand them better and understand the frequency and where they're happening. And as a result, implement better supports for students. It also allows us to modernize our assessment practices. So the SRSS IE is an evidence-based tool. It has a very solid body of research supporting its reliability and validity, and that's really important in today's assessment world. There are so many assessments out there. We want to make sure we are using the best ones that are available to us. And also this idea of using universal assessment, I think, is this more modern approach where we're thinking about, we're screening all of our students. We're implementing it in a way that is equitable. We're not just focusing on specific groups or specific subgroups, but we're really taking this universal approach to understanding and addressing behavior. We're also then using that data that we collect to guide our decision-making around student support. It gives us that real-time identification as well as integration with equity. And then, of course, helps us also address Tier 1 instruction and the improvement of Tier 1. So part of reviewing the data with the SRSSIE is really looking at the data in aggregate, looking at the school level, the classroom level, the grade level, to better understand how can we, infuse better behavioral practices into our Tier 1, not just only about that Tier 2 and Tier 3 identification, but really understanding how we can improve what we're providing for all students. All right, so getting into behavioral health interventions and supports. So with something like the SRSS IE, of course, we're getting this really valuable information on students internalizing and externalizing behaviors, whether or not there is some kind of risk level there. But it's also important to be looking at additional pieces of data as well. So for example, at the elementary level, we want to be also looking at things like if they've been in the office discipline referrals, academic benchmarks, so reading and math scores, any absences, tardiness. And then at the high school level, we have additional things like course failures, GPA, progress reports. And the model is really about kind of bringing all these pieces of data together and making it easy for educators to really understand the constellation or the overlapping needs of students, which then helps us make more effective and robust plans for our students. So it's not just about this one piece of data or this one piece of information, but it's how do we kind of bring that all together effectively. And here are some examples from CI3T where they kind of create these spreadsheets for their users to help them kind of organize all this data. Of course, Emily Rose will kind of point out what we have in mind to kind of make this practice even more efficient. But it's ultimately just about, data accessibility and understanding how to bring in different pieces of data to guide our decision making.
This really fits very well under the umbrella of MTSS, right, Essie? Like that's kind of what we're always supposed to be doing anyway. So
yeah. Yes, exactly. And again here, so we want to be using the results of this type of assessment with other data points. to determine a student's tier level and also ultimately the level of support that they will receive. So thinking about things like, if we're using an SEL screener in addition to a behavioral screener, their academic needs and performance, any kind of behavior incidents, attendance data. So all these things are going to really need to be pulled together to really understand the holistic, picture of our students, what their needs are, and then kind of guide what comes next, which I'll also get into. All right, so the strong behavioral health practice follows screening with support. So there is really no point in screening all of our students if we're not going to support our students or do anything after that screening. So this is a really critical part of the practice, and it's a part that a lot of people struggle with. I think it can be quite difficult, but we know that the data from the SRSS IE can be used across all tier levels. So of course, like I mentioned before we're informing our tier 1 prevention efforts. So looking at the data in aggregate across a building, across a grade level to really understand, are there certain patterns or trends that we're seeing with the data that can be addressed within our tier 1. Also helping guide those teacher delivered low intensity support. So things that our classroom teachers can be doing to help address some of those behavioral needs. And then of course, to identify students who may require additional supports at that tier 2 or tier 3 level. So this is just an example of, that process or the practice of finding those students or identifying students. This is our Branching Minds cohort assessment performance report, but this can be used for different assessment tools. But with something like the SRSS IE, you would want to find those students who perhaps are, have similar struggles, finding students with shared needs and creating those tier 2 intervention groups where we're able to kind of focus on similar strategies. So a tool like this can really help us see that data for each student, but then also kind of understand certain patterns and certain shared needs as well.
And Essie, my understanding of this behavior screener is that unlike some other types of universal screening tools, maybe on the academic side, there is an overall score. And the overall score isn't meaningless, but at the same time, we really do need to treat those internalizing and externalizing risk students differently. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure. And same with students who might be presenting difficulties across both externalizing and internalizing. Like that's a different group as well. But yes, so they're externalizing and internalizing. They are somewhat related, but the relationship is not as strong as you would think. So, and they do represent very distinct underlying needs. And there are different kinds of supports or interventions that might benefit some students who are struggling more with internalizing versus those who might be kind of have more of that externalizing need. Yeah, so then again, so based on those results, of course, here we have our, our Branching Minds library of supports, finding those interventions, those strategies, those programs, practices that are aligned with the need that we have kind of identified through that universal screener and being able to kind of filter down and find appropriate supports for students, all part of that practice. And then developing these behavior support plans. And we do this on Branching Minds already by kind of guiding and scaffolding that whole planning process. So helping educators create SMART goals, identify appropriate progress monitoring assessments, things we might want to be doing alongside an intervention to understand if students are having any kind of response or improving based on that implementation, being able to assign responsibility for the intervention delivery and plan and review of the plan to specific staff members, and then also document the actual implementation and delivery of the intervention itself to make sure that it is being used as we would want it to be used with strong fidelity.
Okay.
All right.
So thank you so much, Essie, giving us all the background on the practice and the instrument. I am really excited to announce here at this summit that we have this partnership that we are going to be launching with CI3T. Again, that's the organization that published the SRSSIE. They are such fantastic partners, a wealth of knowledge, so many resources and training materials that they provide that really, really help school districts understand behavior needs at all levels, you know, the tier 1 level, tier 2 and tier 3, and then also to be able to follow up and systemically support students who have behavioral needs. One of the real connecting threads between CI3T and Branching Minds when we first met was this shared commitment to making sure that any behavior need identification and support planning process is embedded underneath some larger systemic framework of identifying students who need support overall and proactively providing it. So MTSS is a perfect umbrella for this work to fall under. CI3T has a similar continuous improvement model if you're looking to understand what they're doing. At the end of this slide deck, I will provide a lot of resources so that you can go follow up. But first, I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to walk you through the development that we're currently working on in the platform. Essie, if you don't mind kind of taking over, just don't mind interrupting me if anyone has a question.
Okay.
So this is a prototype. This is active development currently with our development team. Actually, our UX designer and I had a meeting with them this week where they kind of gave us a demo and walked through it with us. It's looking fantastic. So we're in really good shape to have this launched with plenty of time for anyone who's already using this assessment and is thinking, hey, I would really like to get away from the paper and the pencil, God forbid, or probably more likely the spreadsheets, and get this work done directly in Branching Minds. So I'm going to walk you through kind of what that experience is going to be like. And so here I am on the All Students page. If I select a group of students and go to the Actions dropdown, for any of you partner districts who are already using Branching Minds to administer the DESA assessment, which is an SEL universal screener, this will feel very familiar. It's a very similar process. Here in that Actions dropdown, I will be able to select Administer the SRSSIE assessment. And I'm going to be taken to a page where I've got all of those students that I've selected. I've got my rating scale up here, and then the behaviors that I need to assess for that student depending on their grade level. This is very much mimicking the spreadsheet type of format that CI3T makes available for free to use. And that's because it's simply the most efficient, right? So the best practice of documenting this work for students is that teachers move student to student, left to right. They kind of rate each student on each behavior separately. And we wanted this to be really easy so you can just tab through each one. With the magic of prototyping, I can pretend that I just did them all, but this really shouldn't be an activity that takes too long. And we want to make sure you can kind of use your keyboard for that. Scrolling down a bit, if you remember, Essie mentioned that the best practice here is that this assessment is only given once per student in a screening window. So in the case of like here for Alex, another teacher has already assessed this student, so I would be able to see who it was who completed that assessment for them. And then I will just submit all those scores at once. I'm just going to show you kind of what it's going to look like on the student page. So here I am on the student overview with all of these other indicators. Again, going back to the main thing we want to do once we've administered the assessment is look at that student's data, look at the results. Are they high risk, moderate risk, or low risk in that internalizing and externalizing measure, as well as their overall score, alongside their attendance data, the number of suspensions they've had, their ELA and math failures, all of the support plans they currently have available, their DESA results, if there is an SEL screener that you're using, and maybe their state test results, their academic performance. Like all of this is really important to inform what that support plan should be. And so that's why it was such a perfect fit for us to have this directly administered from Branching Minds. So that's it. It's so easy peasy. I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'm going to go back to the slide deck, if you will. Bear with me. Make sure I'm on the right page. Okay. That look good, Essie?
Yep.
Okay, great. So just quick overview of this administration experience directly from Branching Minds. So there are a lot of benefits that we see, especially going over and really understanding from CI3T all the recommendations and documentation they provide about if you're a district that wants to start doing this assessment, here are the things that you need to make sure are in place from a technology perspective in order to do it really, really well. There's a lot that goes into the setup. If you are choosing to do this on Excel spreadsheets and making sure that we have the roster list set up correctly, that the teachers are associated with the right students, that they have access to the right students on their form to complete this survey. Want to make sure that all of the school administrators also have access for the students, the scoring and the results. And that's something that's generally handled by IT teams who are very strapped. We actually get all that data directly from rostering systems already. Anyone who already works with the Branching Minds platform knows we kind of ingest that data on a nightly basis to understand which teachers and administrators should have access to which students. So we can kind of leverage that same integration without having to kind of recreate that in another system outside of the platform, which is fantastic. We are also talking about student data, and student data is always very sensitive, of course, but this is really sensitive student data. These are behavioral risk indicators. And so we want to make sure that we're protecting student PII. And there's a lot of guidance and recommendations that CI3T has for our IT teams about the server that you're storing this data on and the permissions that you have to set up, all of these security concerns that if you're working with Branching Minds, you don't have to worry about, because I don't know if you heard the news, but we got our SOC 2 certification just this fall, which if you're not familiar with that, it's an extremely rigorous external vetting process to certify that we have all the safeguards in place that are needed to protect this sensitive student PII. We also have a lot of reporting built into our system that is really going to help you make sure that you are